So what you're telling me is you're running a company that's so fragile that any given intern can just take the whole thing down. And that's still the intern's fault? Are you sure?
Welcome to CyberSecurity Heroes, an IRONSCALES podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to CyberSecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Director of Lifecycle Marketing at IRONSCALES, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. Today I'm joined by Adrian Sanabria. Adrian is a well-rounded thinker and researcher. He has worked as a practitioner, consultant, industry analyst, entrepreneur, community organizer, and evangelist over his 2-decade career. His experience with both the practical and business sides of the industry position him well in his role at the CyberRisk Alliance, where he catalogs the industry's vendors and evaluates their products. Hey Adrian, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome, and we have a super interesting discussion today, but before we begin, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about you and your background and what you're working on these days?
Sure. Yeah, so let me try and give the short version here. I did start out in IT on the enterprise side. If you really want to go back, I did internet tech support for a while in the 90s. But I really consider my first career gig was working for a large credit card processor. Great place to learn security, though. I started in IT there for my first 4 years and then moved into cybersecurity. But I knew pretty much from the beginning that security was where I wanted to go. I was just super interested in just the whole idea of hacking, and that you had these systems up and running, that would do the expected thing, but then there were unexpected, undocumented things that you could do with them. That whole allure of something hidden, that's just waiting to be uncovered was just really, really interesting to me. So yeah, spent some time on the defense side there. The company I worked for let me do a little bit of everything, perhaps to their detriment. If you wanted to do anything, if they didn't have to hire anybody extra, they're like, yeah, sure, go for it. So great place to get experience. But I worked a lot of hours because I was curious about everything. I wanted to learn about everything, and eventually burned myself out there. It got to a point where I realized, actually, they're probably not going to hire anybody else unless I leave. Like, that's the only way to fix this. And it's actually affecting my coworkers. It's affecting the company because I'm not available to do my best job when I'm wearing, I think I calculated I was doing something like, 3.5 full-time jobs.
Wow.
And immediately after I left, they replaced me with 2 full-time people and then hired a third a little bit after that. But excellent place to get your start. PCI started while I was there. So we started PCI from the very beginning. And then I went to consult because I wanted to see how other people made mistakes. And did pen testing for a while. I was a PCI QSA, got to travel a lot, got to see a lot of different environments, how people did things. I thought I was on a CISO path, it was kind of like the obvious security path back then. And then I saw an opening for a job as an industry analyst. And I didn't know really what an industry analyst was back then. I had heard of Gartner and Forrester, mostly through marketing, but didn't really understand what the industry analyst did. And it really appealed to me, this idea that I would kind of think about the different problems in the industry and write about it, and talk to vendors and folks on the defense side and have these great conversations, get to pick people's brains, get to test out ideas, at least verbally. And so that's eventually what led me to leave 451 is I consider it a luxury to get to just sit and think about, deep think about these security problems. You don't get to try them out for real. Like you get to talk about it, but you don't actually, like the hands-on stuff is all gone. So I went to start my own company with a good friend of mine, Kyle, and we started a company called Savage Security. And the whole idea of the company was to try out a bunch of these new ideas. And so we had new ways of delivering a pen test. It was completely different from how anybody was delivering a pen test back then. It's more common now. It's somewhat close to what a purple team engagement would be. But the main thing we noticed is that pen tests weren't delivering a lot of value because people didn't need to be shown the problems they had, needed somebody to help them figure out how to fix it. And that wasn't a service that a pen test would provide, really. So did that, and then ended up getting acquired by a vendor and worked on the vendor side for a while, for a couple of years, and came back to the media industry, research and writing. And what I'm doing now are cybersecurity product reviews. I'm a co-host on a couple Security Weekly podcasts. And also we're building a product vendor database. And we've got 2,200 cybersecurity companies in there and around 9,000, a little over 9,000 products in that database. And it's not available yet. We're still building the actual front end for it.
Wow.
But the database itself is built.
So you've gone through quite the roller coaster and a journey along your way. It sounds super interesting and diverse. So
and that was intentional. I wanted to try a bunch of different things because I didn't know what the best fit was going to be, and I was diagnosed with ADHD late in my life, at 37, so I learned that that's just an aspect of how I think. I just constantly need this new stimuli. It's part of why I'm curious, and why not just take a role that encourages that, where that's actually part of the job. Like on the podcast, we're constantly talking about the business side of security, new funding, new acquisitions, but also the technical side, attack techniques and, different defensive techniques and stuff like that. So yeah, very much satisfies that part of my brain that needs new stuff all the time, needs to learn all the time.
So I'd like to quote one of the quotes of yours that I found. It goes, "There's a crisis of confidence in the cybersecurity community. Billions in marketing pushes products as the solution to protecting organizations. Thousands of organizations running these products get breached every year, and according to most metrics, the problems are getting worse, not better." I would like to ask you, what are some of the other catalysts aiding in this poor ecosystem other than what you mentioned?
Yeah, so I think the common theme you see, I mentioned metrics there in that quote that you read, is an inability to understand what's working and what's not. In a lot of cases, like the breach can't be the metric for whether my security program worked or not, or whether a security tool worked or not. There's just too many factors, too much complexity. We need, a more focused and intentional approach to determining whether or not the tools we're using works. If you compare the security industry to safety industries, so airplane crashes, automobile crashes, any kind of industry that focuses on improving the safety, in the physical world, there's data for them to look at, and they can definitively do an assessment and say, here's what failed, here's what didn't. Of course, in a lot of cases, there's operator error, it's people, that made the mistake. And still, there's technically things we can do to improve that. There's automobiles now have blind spot monitoring systems. They have cruise control that will stop you to a dead stop, if the car in front of you slams on the brakes, lane departure warning, even systems that detect how drowsy you are and will give you a rating between like 1 and 5 and how sleepy you are. They're actually watching your face and your eyes and stuff like that. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. And one of the issues is all that data is shared and it's public. When there's an airplane accident, that report's public. It gets published. And even the ones that aren't public, they're shared with the people that need to see them. On the cybersecurity side, a lot of that's private. In a lot of cases, it's just the company that had the breach, maybe the insurance company and the company that did the investigation. If a third party did the investigation, they're the only ones that really know what happened. So the industry doesn't get to improve from that. We don't get to learn that, maybe it was a technical control failure or a process failure. So we're all just guessing at this point. Like the people making the products are guessing, the people buying the products are guessing and hoping, that this is the solution. And there's just not enough data. There's not enough of an intentional approach with a closed loop, to determine, yes, this is going to be effective or not.
And I know that in some of your previous talks, you talk specifically about we build products badly, we do sales badly, and we raise money badly. Maybe you want to expand a little bit on those.
Yeah, those are actually Haroon's words.
Okay.
Yeah. And Haroon, I love the fact that we gave that talk together because we don't fully agree on all the points there. We agree, I'd say probably somewhere between 80 and 95%. I feel like, he feels like the analyst industry is just scrap it, start over, or don't do it at all. Whereas I believe, some of it is beneficial. When I was an industry analyst, I always felt like my role was to make sense of the industry for everyone else. Especially, God, the industry's love and marketing's love of buzzwords. Sometimes you go to a company's website and you have no idea what they're doing. It's impossible to work out what it's doing. We do news segments on our podcasts. Sometimes the summary of the news segment on a news item is, we read the press release and we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea what they're announcing. It's just the words are English, but none of us can understand them. But yeah, and what Haroon was talking about there with building products badly, raising money badly, is that there's lots of perverse incentives. When your company raises money from a VC, for example, one of the first things that happens is all the other companies in that VC's portfolio, they're pretty much expected to start using that new company in the portfolio's product, so they become customers, so that's one of the ways that you can kind of, there's this aspect of fake it till you make it, like, yes, we've got early customers. And yes, there are companies out there that will try one of everything. Universal Music, Netflix are great about trying out new products, giving detailed feedback to startups, because it's in their best interest to help them build a good, useful, valuable product. Because even if they're not interested in it now, maybe a couple of years from now, it will develop into something that they would spend money on. But yeah, overall, we see cases where entire security categories, will raise billions. They'll all get acquired. And then you just kind of see these products disappear, as they realize, yeah, there wasn't really a market for them. So it's again, I think we go back to that theme of determining, if these products are actually something that people need, and they can provide value.
And I know we're going to get into that later in the show, so I'm not going to give any spoilers. But I know you do, I think it's a hobby, you do some kind of post-mortems of famous breaches. And I was wondering if we could tie in some of the themes that we've been talking about, the lack of closed feedback loop and, say, transparency, to some of the post-mortems that you've done on breaches.
Yeah. So, I think before I dive into details overall, I think the key thing that you see is that companies aren't prepared for the breach. And I don't mean to say that they're not prepared in that they hadn't bought the products they need, they hadn't rolled out the technical controls. They had done all those things in most cases, but they were unprepared in that they had never practiced a breach, what a breach is like to detect, what they're going to say to their customers and to the public. And you see that publicly in the result. You see companies that panic and try and deny that the breach is happening, and then a couple of days later, they have to admit that it's happening, because journalists have copies of the leaked data or something like that. Like, you can't deny it anymore. Here it is.
Or they blame it on an intern.
Yeah, blame it on an intern, because any solid, robust company can be taken down by a single intern. Like,
perfectly plausible.
That's how your company should be designed. Like it's so embarrassing to say. It's like turn that around a little bit. So what you're telling me is you're running a company that's so fragile that any given intern can just take the whole thing down. And that's still the intern's fault? Are you sure? Yeah, I think everyone, is agreed. And we've seen companies handle breaches really badly, like trying to point blame like that. And the amazing thing about a breach is I've seen companies have their best sales day ever because people were so impressed with how they handled the breach. So the world doesn't end when the breach occurs and gets announced. There's an opportunity to get out there, control the conversation or not, and just let journalists and the general public, just kind of come up with their own truths. And they're going to assume the worst. So it's really the company's choice there. But the main theme is just a lack of preparedness, and I like to think of it like a sport. If you practice a sport once a year, PCI requires an incident response test once a year, you're not going to be very good at that sport.
Yeah.
You're lucky to even remember how the sport works. And, most people, ask them what's in their incident response report. And if they haven't had a major incident, nobody's looked at it. Nobody knows what's in it or if it's up to date. Maybe the calling tree, the individuals in it, are still folks who have left the company and it's not even been updated. So, yeah, just to kind of frame this whole thing, if you don't simulate what happens in a breach and you don't practice at detecting and stopping those kinds of things, don't expect to be good at it when it happens. Don't expect things to go well.
Yeah. It makes perfect sense. Just like you're activating your muscle memory. If you don't have that muscle memory, you're going to struggle, like you said.
Yeah.
So taking it back to doing these investigations of yours, I know we spoke in particular about Equifax. Would you mind summarizing or highlighting like 5 key stats and facts that
Sure.
the public wouldn't have known and they only surfaced after the investigation?
Yeah, and first of all, I wouldn't be able to do any of this work unless some of this data came out. So the fact that this investigation, like details down to when the company had meetings to discuss the Struts vulnerability. There's a detailed timeline in the investigation. It gets down to what tools, employees tried to use to find Struts in the environment. Those are the kinds of details that we need from breaches and incidents to be able to improve as an industry. And I think it's going to be tough to do that until, there's more cases like Equifax. But that's why I constantly use Equifax as an example because it's very well documented and all that documentation is out, available to the public pretty much. So yeah, some of those things, clear text credentials in files is one of those, and people think, oh, the idiots were using a text file as a, place to store passwords. And I don't think that's the case. So having some experience in the system that was actually hacked, it was the J2EE system. And it's fairly common to have a database connection file, whether if you're using Oracle, it's going to be like a dbnames.ora or, J2EE app, you've got your .properties files and you'll have like a db.properties file. And that'll have database connection strings in it. So it'll have like the DNS name for the database, the port number, username, password, and the actual database or the schema within that database that you want to connect to. Over the last 30 years, it's pretty common to have one of those files in a very large organization like Equifax. And to give you an idea of how large their IT infrastructure is, this is a company that owns somewhere over 70,000 publicly routable IP addresses.
Wow.
So like their IP space alone, they own like I don't even know what that's worth, like $1 billion of IP space, these days with IPv4 exhaustion, probably worth a lot. So in companies like that, these database connection string files, sometimes for convenience, they'll just put everything in it. Like every database in the whole company, there'll be like 99 entries in this one text file, just so that they don't have to wrangle different versions of it, or make a custom one each time. And, speaking from experience here, I worked at several places that did this. And yeah, an attacker finds that file, that's a gold mine. a login to every database in the company, with the DNS name, where it lives, the usernames and passwords, which are probably reused other places. Yeah, and that's probably what they landed on when they got onto the system, because that would have been in the same directory or one directory away from where the actual struts jar file was. So it would have been right in that J2EE app that they hacked into. So that's the first thing they found. I guess you can argue that there's products you can buy, secrets management products we have now that give you better ways of doing that kind of thing. But still, it comes down to a process issue, people and process issue. I mean, there should be some concerted effort to make sure that to update that process and not do that anymore. I don't think there's anybody that's going to disagree that having clear text credentials flying around is a good thing these days. And the examples I'm pulling from are over 15 years old. So, we've had some time to improve from that. Another thing are, they had their IDS, their internal IDS depended on SSL TLS inspection, so decrypting internal traffic so that it can be inspected. And something, I forget the exact number of certs. It was something like 18 certs had expired and were expired for over 18 months. So this is just not maintaining the tool.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's an issue I see with a lot of organizations where they don't consider the amount of staffing they need to properly take care of the products they're buying. So, I don't care how amazing the product is, and what the claims are. Like if you don't have the staff to maintain it, you run into this kind of situation.
Yeah.
Where, all the certs are expired and and that's actually how Equifax detected that they were breached, was fixing those certs. So the moment that no, I take that back. I think they had some other indicator they might have a problem before that. And that's why they updated the certs. And as soon as they did that, they were able to confirm it. And they were able to see the attack. So the IDS worked great. It told them, hey, you got a bunch of issues here. And it would have done so much, much sooner had they kept those certs up to date. So with Equifax, one of the biggest shame is that they totally took this issue seriously. They knew there was a struts vulnerability. They knew it was remote code execution, big deal, CVSS 10, like every way you measured it, it was something they should be worried about. And they had special meetings about it, and people were assigned to go out and make sure they didn't have this vulnerability in their environment. And what's depressing is they failed to do so. So they rounded up everybody, told everybody this is important, go out and find it. And they just couldn't. In fact, they failed to find it in their environment before the bad guys found it from the outside. Without the benefit of documentation and institutional knowledge and all that stuff.
Wow.
And of course, this was your classic legacy. Any pen tester knows the story. Legacy application, documentation didn't exist or is gone and lost. Whoever knew anything about it has long since moved on or been laid off. And so, they're kind of blind to it. But some of the reasons they didn't find it is they didn't know how to properly use the tools to find it. They ran a static analyzer tool on the system that had the struts vulnerability, but didn't use the recursive flag. So when they ran the tool, it only searched the current directory, didn't search any of the directories beneath that. So they ran that one directory away from where that struts jar was sitting. That's one of those moments where you're like, you were so close.
It's sounds like a movie. It doesn't.
Yeah, I know.
You couldn't write a better script.
Yeah.
No pun intended. But,
Right, yeah. Yeah, they could have written a better script. That's a good pun. Yeah, and their DAST tools didn't find it. They tried a number of different tools. It's not surprising the DAST tool didn't find it. Struts is notoriously difficult to find with a dynamic web scanner. But yeah, that, and they built a snort rule to look for attempts to hack the struts vulnerability, but they didn't do it right and they didn't test it. So they built the snort rule, didn't test it, threw it into production, and it didn't work. Again, that's a process issue. The fact that they did no QA on it, they didn't do any testing. Another opportunity where they could have found it earlier but didn't. And then their patching process, there was no remediation follow-up, so it was just kind of people would get told things that needed to be patched and nothing ever came back. It was one-way communication. So that was a pretty severe process and communication issue. And I don't think any of that you would find in the published about the Equifax breach. All you hear is that somebody failed to patch it and, Struts was to blame, and then the CISO had a music degree. Those were the three things you got if you read the news stories about it.
Yeah.
Not any of the stuff, the actionable stuff you could actually take back and apply to your own security program to improve.
CyberSecurity Heroes is brought to you by IRONSCALES, an AI-powered, self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
Fascinating insights, which brings me to my next question. Are we perhaps a victim of our own success? Too many products and trying to find solutions for them versus getting the basics right. There's a popular phrase, I've heard it many times, good security is not sexy.
Mm-hmm.
And like one example that comes to mind is vendors pushing zero trust as a product when actually it was never intended to be that way. It's a strategy, not a product. So just kind of curious to get your thoughts on this.
I would reframe that question to say a victim of their success, because there's the buyers and the sellers. And the sellers have been very successful in raising money and in using that, money towards marketing and sales to sell those products. But, if the actual answer to the problem is practice in building better products or building better processes, how do you compete with the billions and billions being thrown into marketing for the products themselves? There's nobody spending billions, telling you, you should configure group policy better, and fix your Active Directory issues and use laps, and just like so many things you can do for free. And it's kind of the thing we run into over and over. Most companies already have everything they need. They're just not using it to its fullest extent, or not using it correctly, or don't know how to use it in the context of a breach or preventing a breach. Like for example, one of my favorite things to do as a pen tester, if I needed to do anything on a host that required using pen testing tools, I'd turn off antivirus. And every single antivirus out there will send off a message, to the central antivirus console that it's been switched off, that somebody just did a netstop McAfee or a netstop Symantec. But nobody ever sees that. I've never run into a case where somebody notices that I turned off AV. So I do what I need to do and then turn AV back on, and nobody would detect that. I mean, for a number of years, nobody would detect somebody creating a new domain admin. So a lot of this is you don't need machine learning. You need to make sure you're going to see the alert that says, I hacked you was created as a new domain admin. Because as pen testers, I mean, a lot of times you'd see cheeky stuff like that, where somebody would make it really obvious in the name of the account they created or something like that, or put a comment in the account, because you want them to be able to undo everything you did at the end of the pen test, right? If you actually made any changes to production systems. And I mean, it was actually depressing to me as a pen tester. I mean, it's fun and it's funny at first, but I remember one a good friend of mine who's pen tested a lot longer than I did. He's still doing it. He was pen testing a children's hospital. In the first year, it's funny, to see how insecure they are. But then you come in year 2, year 3, year 4, and your same accounts that you created on year 1 are still there.
Oh
you still have the same domain admin accounts there.
Wow.
Like they haven't even read the reports.
Wow, that's crazy.
And then maybe your kid is at that hospital. It's not the same anymore. I've actually talked at least one company into using security is not sexy as the tagline. Axonius uses that to market their asset management product, which tickled me. But it's true, and we're seeing more and more companies focusing on the basics. Making products that are easier to deploy and help knock out some of those basics.
With all these new vendors and technology on the market, are we really safer today than we were years ago?
I think we are, but not necessarily because of the security industry. I think some of our biggest advancements are the transparent kind. It's when Microsoft decides to make a default in Windows more secure, or when Salesforce or Google or Apple with iOS decide to ship more secure defaults, does more than a whole generation of security products has in terms of security improvements. So I think ultimately that's the best way to improve security, is to just build it in from the start, from the tools we're using from the start. So like GitLab, GitHub have a lot more potential to do good for the security industry, than entire categories of pure play dedicated security products, in my opinion.
Can buyers actually evaluate if their security software is any good?
So, that's actually a challenge for me. I'm testing security products, and I've found you have to create a separate methodology for each set of products. You're not going to test an email security product the same way you're going to test an EDR product, the same way you're going to test an IDS. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do is a lot of folks don't have time to come up with that methodology, time to create a test environment to do their POCs. That's a specialized function. Maybe if you've got a security team of 30, 40, 50 folks, yeah, you have the resources to do something like that. But most security teams aren't that big, and there's tons of companies that have no security team at all. So they're looking to Gartner and, Magic Quadrants and, maybe Twitter. Honestly, the best way is to just get a direct referral, from someone you trust. So if you're a CISO, who are you going to trust on a product purchase more, Gartner or 8 other CISOs that you talk to and gave you recommendations? So that's where we are right now, is really word of mouth, I think, is the most effective way to find out if a product is good, especially if okay, this CISO has a whole team that's going to put these products to the ringer. I've heard that over and over, like, oh, if company X is using it, I don't even need to do a proof of concept, because I know their process.
Yeah.
And their process is legit. If they're using you, then I'm good.
Nice.
They've already done the testing for me.
You made me laugh with Harun at one of your talks where you spoke about the investment that vendors make at RSA in their demo stations versus the merch and ball pits. Maybe
Yeah.
we would be in a better state today.
Yeah, so I actually created a game that I tried to get people to play at RSA called Duck, Duck, Bear. And the idea was, just to play on Duck, Duck, Goose on the kids game. The idea is you and a friend go talk to the same vendor and they explain to you what they do, and then you both get back together and you compare notes. And, if one of you, if they drew a duck, or described a duck and the other says they described a goose, that's pretty close. They're both birds, they're both waterfowl. But if one of you comes back with a duck and the other one comes back with a bear, that's not even close. And it's true. Like the people that they send to man these booths, a lot of them are just there to collect leads. Some of them are hired right there in Las Vegas or in San Francisco from staffing firms to just, hand things out or scan people's badges. I mean, there always are going to be people from the company there as well, but oftentimes they're sales folks, and the people who actually can explain things to you are often in meetings all day. So they got one-on-one meetings with prospects or existing customers. So that they're not there at the booth.
And the infamous.
And then there's how you use the booth itself. That was Harun's thing. Is I mean, you can spend your money 2 different ways. You can actually get your customer excited about your product, get them putting hands on your product, sometimes both literally and figuratively. Or you can have a ball pit, and like they might have some fun in your booth, and an hour later they don't even remember your name, So one is probably a better use of your marketing budget than the other.
Or the infamous booth babes, which are now taboo. Yeah.
They're banned from a lot of conferences.
Yeah.
Some companies toe that line, though. Some
Yeah.
companies definitely toe that line. But yeah, most events now have that in their, formally in their terms, that everyone has to be professionally dressed.
Mm-hmm. Let's switch back to product testing and performance. What are some of the things that you look for, when doing product testing? I know you mentioned total cost of ownership and labor and skills.
Yeah, so one of the things I've de-emphasized is performance testing. Most of the time when you see product testing, like AV testing is kind of the classic example. It's been around for years and years and years. This product captured or detected 180 samples out of 200. This one only detected 170 out of 200 or something like that, which is, I guess that's useful knowledge. I think if you run that 2 weeks later, the two numbers could be flipped, and then 2 weeks after that, maybe they're flipped again, or maybe they're the same. So I don't see it as terribly important. I think it's inherently like a laziness in coming up with the methodology. Like that's the easiest thing to address. And yes, that is, effectively what matters in the product, how much of this malware is it going to stop? But what also matters is how many people does it take to run the product and to maintain it? What kind of skills do those people need to have? What are the requirements of it, or prerequisites, for using this product? What's the UI and the UX like? And that goes to labor quite a bit too. I remember we were using a very popular WAF product, and we had one guy in security operations dedicated to just tuning the WAF. Yeah, he came to work, he logged into the WAF, he clicked things, and at the end of the day, he logged out and he went home. And he just did that every day. I remember at one point, he put in a request for a larger monitor because in the UI for this WAF, he would have to go to add an IP or a list of IPs to a block list, to a blacklist. He would have to go through like 4 levels of right-click context menus to the point to where it ran off the bottom of the monitor, and he couldn't get to the item in the list to click. So he actually needed a larger, the UI was so bad, a 17-inch monitor wasn't big enough. He needed like a 21-inch monitor or something like that.
Right.
So UI, UX matters. It really, really matters. Like it's just, first of all, it's ridiculous that it's an 8-step process for him to drop IP addresses into a block list. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of other things to consider. Ideally, wherever he was getting that list of IPs should have been funneled straight into an API that dropped them in the blacklist, because he wasn't doing any analysis on them. He was copying and pasting from the FBI email that came in every day and just dropping them into that blacklist. FBI said, hey, these are known bad IPs, you should block them, and copy paste, which is should have been a feed, or, an API should have been involved somewhere there. You shouldn't have even been doing it through the UI. So those are the kinds of things that I think, a lot of stuff around product ownership and using the product, that are very important and should be evaluated.
Yeah, like from my experience, a lot of folks are fixated around like superficial metrics. Like you mentioned, just looking at detection rates. I mean, yes, it's important, but you need to look at, the bigger picture holistically. And I don't know whose fault it is, if it's the vendor's fault not setting forth the right success metrics.
Yeah, so this is one thing that I think Haroon was very passionate about and emphasized a lot at the end of that talk that we had is that, and I feel absolutely the vendor should be responsible for pushing things in the right direction, but Haroon's right also that the buyer has a lot of power, and the buyer should push back, when a product isn't good enough, and just not enough buyers are doing that. And again, from the buyer perspective, I see the issue because the average company still has like 4 dozen, over 50 security products, 70 security products, something like that. Like it's becomes a time and an overhead issue. Ideally, yeah, you go into this feedback loop where you tell a company, no, it's not good enough. Netflix does this really well. They give really good feedback, and they test a lot of products. But not everybody's Netflix. Not everybody can do that. So I think ultimately, yeah, I mean, vendors need to build better products. And I don't think that's going to happen until they have a better idea of what better products look like. Like one thing we were discussing on one of our podcasts recently is the White House executive order talked about, requiring SBOMs. And beyond that, we were talking with a vendor about, also getting into behaviors. Like for something like SolarWinds, it would be nice if SolarWinds could hand you a file that said, hey, here's all the domain names and IP addresses you should ever see our products talking outbound to. You see anything other than these, it's not us. Like there's something wrong. And it would be great to get like a JSON file from a vendor with that information that you could just upload into your threat hunting platform, SIM, wherever you do your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem stems from a lot of the reasons we spoke about earlier. Companies doing sales badly, hiring badly, doing marketing badly. It just creates misinformation, confused buyers, and it's just a perpetual flywheel. And it makes it very hard to evaluate products. And I think that's what you're trying to solve. I would love to know what you're doing and what change you're trying to bring about.
Yeah, so I mean, customers need to know what better looks like, and what to be asking for. Like I said, if you don't have the time to put together the methodology, to do the testing, to do, a proper POC, and you also just need to be, I think aware of some of the issues to know to push back and to ask for those from a vendor. So I think a lot of vendors, like even if you have a couple people working for the vendor that feel passionately that, yeah, we should create this JSON file, we should give it to people, somebody's going to come back and say, okay, well, who's asking for it? Like how many customers are asking for that? And if the answer is 0, it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. So that number has to be more than 0. So if I can do something to educate buyers that, hey, this is what you should be asking for, this is what you should expect from a product. This should be table stakes for a product. This should be just a basic feature that you should expect from it. Then we can start to see that change, I think. Because even when those more sophisticated buyers figure that out, they're not announcing it to the world. They're going to demand, okay, we need that JSON file, or, we need your product at a minimum has to do X, Y, and Z. And maybe that trickles down to the less sophisticated buyers. Maybe it doesn't. So yeah, we need a way to get to a higher percentage of the buyers. And that's what I'm doing. The product reviews we're doing are free and open to everyone. And, we just monetize it on the back end. We hope that maybe some of these products we review, those vendors want to do advertising with us after the fact, but we don't do any business with them on that, before we do the review. And we go through the reviews just like any other customer would. Somebody was really upset that I didn't test one of their favorite attack surface management companies. And I thought, man, did I just overlook them? And I went back and looked, and they just never responded to any of my emails. So I didn't get to test their product. And if I were a buyer trying to buy the product, that would have been my experience. And I hear this all the time. Like, I would love to throw money at these guys, but I can't get them to take it.
Yeah, you mentioned business experience. You're not able to gather the business experience or feel that business experience when you're reviewing a product or reading a product review.
Right.
You only get that when you actually start to engage with the vendor.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, one of the things we do in our product reviews is we'll actually go over claims that they make in their marketing, and judge whether those claims are reasonable or not, or if they're overreaching a little bit. And yeah, we'll talk about the process of onboarding the application. It's like some vendors will want to do like an onboarding meeting with you. They'll want to walk you through the implementation. A lot of them do some white glove work where oftentimes it's during the POC they'll actually help out with this. They'll help you do the initial tuning of the product. Once that's taken care of and they point out some of the stuff you don't want to miss, some of the more important features of the product. Do a little training, that then you're good to go. And that's good to understand. Like some companies do that, some companies don't. And if I'm using your product and I miss the best feature of your product, and you didn't tell me it was the best feature of your product, it's kind of on you. Or if you didn't make it obvious, like I've had cases where I totally did overlook the coolest feature of a product because it was impossible to find unless you knew like this tiny little place to click. Again, it was like a UI, just a terrible UI issue. Like I wouldn't have even thought to click on that, until you told me. You were not using any recognizable design language.
And you also mentioned one of the biggest problems is deployment and ROI.
Yeah, so it's you mentioned some of the metrics we use, like time to value. How long from when somebody gives me a license key, and I download the OVI or, however I deploy this product, should I expect it to take until the product's up and running and I'm actually getting value out of it? And to answer that question, you have to know what value looks like. Maybe it's not ROI in the business sense, but I think as a buyer, that's important too, for you to be able to define what does value look like, because some products, they're designed to just sit there and do nothing, right? Like until something bad happens. And like I remember early days of FireEye, this is some of the complaints of these products is if a security product is quiet for a long time, how do you know it's even turned on or working? That's kind of a like a customer success, user management kind of issue where, you do need some kind of feedback from time to time to let you know that this thing is alive and still working. So I remember the first time we put in FireEye, like the first job was to create the script. Like instead of iCar, they had a PDF that you could download. Yeah, and they gave you a URL for this PDF. And 100% of the time when, a FireEye NX saw this PDF, it would trigger. And we'd use that just to ensure we functionally knew the product was working and turned on. Because I have been in situations where we had an incident and we got to log into the SIM and we found out the SIM's been turned off for a week. Like they did maintenance in the data center like the week before, and they just happen to be the kind of hardware where when you give power back to them, they don't turn back on their own. You have to physically push the button to get them to turn back on. And nobody pushed a button on the SIM, so it was off. So yeah, I hope that answered the question. I kind of went off on a thing.
No, you're good. So I think as we wrap up this episode, what advice can you give to both buyers and vendors?
Advice to buyers and vendors. We publish all our methodologies when we do the product testing, so hopefully that helps, but companies are so afraid of sharing their successes and their failures. There's this whole, on the buyer side, this whole concern about, well, if everybody knows what I'm using, or like what products I have and what my security controls are like, then I'll somehow be more vulnerable. And I think we have to get past that, to be able to collectively succeed more, as a group. I still talk to a lot of buyers that like myths that have been dispelled decades ago, like they're still hanging on to some of these myths just because they don't have a good network of people to talk to. So even if people aren't sharing their failures and their successes publicly, join an ISAC, or find a Slack group, find a Discord group, find a group of people that you meet up with at conferences or on Twitter, where you can privately talk to people about what works and doesn't work for you. Like you need to communicate with peers just because in this industry, people aren't comfortable talking to each other. And honestly, the vendors need to hear a lot of that feedback too, so I think we need a better mechanism because again, that's overhead. Like for me to give you a detailed review of your product, like I don't have time for that for all 70 of my security vendors, to give detailed feedback. So I think we need a better mechanism for security vendors to gather that. I think vendors can help with those methodologies as well. Why shouldn't that methodology come from the vendor? You tell me how to best test your product, and maybe they can help from that perspective.
It's really been fascinating speaking with you today, and I really appreciate the conversation and your perspective. If anyone listening has any follow-up questions or would like to connect with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Sure. Twitter's probably the easiest. I'm Zawaba on Twitter. It's SAWABA on Twitter. So my DMs are open. You can hit me up there. It's probably the easiest way. I'm on LinkedIn too. There's a number of ways, but Twitter's probably easiest. I check Twitter daily.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Adrian, for taking the time to join us today on Cybersecurity Heroes. And to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
Thanks. I enjoyed it, and excellent questions.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.